Hi, everyone. My name is Marissa Cleary with the Emergency Capital Investment Program. This short video will go over the template instructions for filling out your quarterly and annual QSR reports. There have been a couple changes from the reports and instructions you've been using. It's mostly the same, but this video is going to go over what the new instructions are, and those will be applicable to the reports, starting with the ones due at the end of January 2024 for quarterly data from the last quarter of 2023. So first, I'd just like to go over the qualified and deep impact lending categories. We can see if you look across the rows in the figure, there are loans to people, businesses, and projects. And then there are also place-based categories that a loan can qualify under. A loan does not have to qualify under a people category, for example, to also be considered for place-based categories. It can only qualify because it's in a rural community, or it can only qualify if it's to an LMI borrower, or it can be both. So for the people categories, we can see that the light blue bubbles here are for qualified lending. So if you have an LMI borrower with income between 0 to 120% of area median income, that would be a qualified lending category. A low income borrower is by definition a subset of an LMI borrower because that covers incomes from 0 up to only 80% of area median income. And you can see that because the blue circle under deep impact lending for low income borrowers is entirely encompassed by the lighter blue circle. The same is true of mortgage lending to other targeted populations, being a category which is a subset of other targeted populations. So if you have a loan which is mortgage lending to OTP, that loan would count for both the mortgage lending to OTP and the general qualified lending category of other targeted populations. If you look down at projects, this is also true for affordable housing and deeply affordable housing, as well as qualified PWI and deep impact PWI. The main change that we've made with the new instructions is to expand the definition of qualified PWI. Previously, it had only included projects which benefit LMI borrowers and communities, whereas deep impact PWI was for projects which benefited low-income borrowers or benefited minority borrowers or businesses. We've expanded the definition of qualified PWI to also include projects which benefit minority borrowers or businesses, so that deep impact PWI is also a subset entirely encompassed by qualified PWI. So if you have a loan to a project which benefits low-income borrowers, that would count in both categories. If it benefits LMI borrowers, it would be only the qualified PWI category. And then if it benefits minority borrowers or businesses, it would be both the deep impact and the qualified categories. If we go back up to the businesses section, you'll see that it's a little bit more complicated. The other main change that we've made to the instructions is we've renamed the underserved small businesses category to just be called underserved businesses, as that's a bit more accurate, since they don't need to be a small business to also be in the underserved businesses category. So to qualify under the qualified lending category of small businesses, that is accomplished by the gross revenues of the business being less than $1 million. Separately, if you want a loan to qualify for the underserved business category, that can qualify in one of 3 ways. The first way is if its gross revenues are less than $100,000. So if that's the case, that loan would then be both an underserved business and a small business, since gross revenues of less than $100,000 are also less than $1 million. However, if you have a loan to, let's say, a minority-owned business, which has gross revenues of greater than $1 million, that loan would count for underserved businesses, but not for small businesses. When you get down to the place-based categories, it's best to just determine which place-based, qualified, or deep impact categories the loan qualifies for using the QSR reference data set and the FIPS code of that loan. We've also published a new template for your reporting. This template is available on the website for download and will also be available when you go into the impact portal for download in there. The main change that we've made regarding how the templates are used is not within the template itself, but now you will be submitting 5 QSR reports instead of 4, as far as 5 Excel files instead of 4. So previously, on April 30th, 2024, you would have submitted in 1 Excel file quarterly data for schedules A and B for Q1 of 2024, as well as annual data for 2023 in schedules C and D in the same file. And we realized that might cause some confusion, so we've split up that file, and now there will be 5 files instead of 4. So for each year of reporting data, you will submit 4 Excel files with quarterly data in schedules A and B only, and then additionally 1 Excel file with annual data in schedules C and D only. And this should be easy to see when you go into the impact portal. The title of the reports that you can go into to submit will either say Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, or annual. The new template will largely look the same as the template you've been using. Most of the changes we made are changes that are hidden from your view, and they're to make it easier for us to check the data and cross-check across the multiple schedules of data. So that should make our validation process a lot faster. The biggest difference that you can see is that the new template will open to this rubric tab. And that's how you can make sure that you're using the new template. This tab goes over the various data checks that we complete on your data so that you can check them yourself and you can understand the data better. So this will go through the orange color here, our checks that we do on schedules A and B with the quarterly data. And then the checks in blue are checks that we do to compare the sum of the quarterly data with the annual data. So in Schedule A, it mostly looks the same, and I'm using the credit union version of the template here. So the rows will be slightly different for the bank and holding company version. We've added this footnote to make sure that you realize that the qualified lending originations in columns C and D include qualified lending for loans which are not also meeting some category of deep impact lending. So if you have a loan which is to a rural county, which is qualified lending, and that loan is also to a low-income borrower, and then an LMI borrower as well, but they're to a low-income borrower, which is deep impact lending, that loan would only show up once in Schedule A, and it would show up in columns E and F for deep impact lending. If you have a loan which is only deep impact lending, so like only to an LMI borrower or only to an underserved business, let's say, that would only show up in the deep impact lending originations columns E and F as well. If you have a loan which is only to a qualified lending category and does not match any deep impact lending categories, that's what would show up in columns C and D. For total originations in columns A and B, that includes qualified lending originations from columns C and D, plus the numbers in deep impact lending originations from columns E and F, plus any other lending activity which is defined in the instructions and which does not count for any qualified lending categories or deep impact lending categories. So if we put in some example numbers here, first, we'll see that once I've put numbers into deep impact lending originations, these other fields show up orange because it's telling me if you have something in deep impact lending, you should also have something in other categories. So you're missing some data at this point. So now we know that given these numbers, total originations has to be at least 150 loans, because it's going to be this 100 from column C as well as the 50 from column E. And then let's say we have some other lending activity which does not qualify for qualified lending or deep impact lending, and that's an additional 50 loans. So now, since the comparisons between these numbers all make sense and all necessary fields are filled out, we see no orange cells telling us we have an error. If we go to Schedule B, let's say these 50 loans from deep impact lending, they're from low-income borrowers. But let's say I mess something up and somehow I end up with 60 loans here. That's going to show up red or orange because it's comparing this 60 to this 50. And it's saying you can't have an amount of loans in one set of columns in Schedule B for deep impact, which is greater than the number of total deep impact you have in your Schedule A. So if this meets what's in Schedule A, that error goes away. But you'll notice there's also an error over here in LMI borrowers. And that's because if you have a loan to a low-income borrower, as I explained earlier, that will also necessarily meet the definition for an LMI borrower. So this is telling me, I see you have some loans in low-income borrowers. That means you need to have some here. So let's say that these 50 are also LMI borrowers, and then some of that 100 that we have in qualified lending is also to LMI borrowers. So let's say we have 80 here. And now there's no obvious errors. Another thing it checks for is we can see that there's 150 loans in total based on Schedule A, which could meet a qualified lending category, right? Because these 50 in deep impact, they could also meet qualified lending categories in addition to deep impact lending categories. So let's say if in the qualified lending category of rural communities, I say I have 200 loans, that's going to show up orange as an error because this 200 is bigger than the 150 of total qualified lending loans that I've said it's possible for me to have. So if I reduce this to 150, that error goes away. So those are the main comparisons we're doing between Schedules A and B. Similarly to how the low-income borrowers and LMI borrowers interact with each other, the same will be true for mortgage lending to other targeted populations. So if I have 10 loans here, this will error and tell me I need to have some loans in columns C and D as well. So let's say all of these happen to be mortgages. And I apologize in advance for not putting things in the correct row categories here. Just ignore that for now and just imagine it's one row across. So we would go through the rest of these categories, checking if our loans meet any of the other place-based characteristics. And then once we get to affordable housing and deeply affordable housing, that will also compare to make sure there are at least as many loans in the affordable housing category as there are in the deeply affordable housing category. And same with public welfare and community development investments, qualified and the same category, deep impact. So as you're going through Schedule B, you can also easily tell if the category that you're looking at is qualified lending or deep impact lending, because the qualified lending categories have this white header and the deep impact lending categories have this darker gray header. When we start looking at your quarterly versus annual data, this will be filled out in a separate Excel, of course, as we've split up the Excels. But for the sake of example, pretend it's all in one Excel. When you look at the LMI borrowers in Schedule C1, you'll see that the low income and LMI categories, instead of just being split up into 2 categories, have been split up into 4. So really these first 2 categories those are your low income borrowers up to 80% of AMI. And then all these categories are your LMI borrowers. So when we look at your annual data, if we were to sum these two categories, that number should be the same as if we summed the quarterly data from Schedule B for low-income borrowers. And then if we were to sum all 4 of these categories in your annual data, that should equal the sum of your Schedule B quarterly data across the quarters for LMI borrowers. In Schedule C2, note that this schedule is only for underserved businesses. Small businesses only show up in Schedule B, since they can only qualify based on the gross revenue threshold. We don't need more detail on how they qualify. For underserved businesses, since they can qualify with a variety of characteristics, this is where we get that more detailed information. So importantly, if you have a loan to an underserved business, which is underserved because it's majority owned by Black Americans, in Schedule B, that loan would only show up in underserved businesses. You wouldn't need to also put that in other targeted populations in Schedule B, since this other targeted populations is a people category, not a business category. For this loan to a Black-owned underserved business, we would know that it has that Black-owned characteristic when we get to the annual data in Schedule C2. When you get into the Schedule Ds, those should be a bit simpler. You simply organize them by, it'll split up into the FIPS code, and Schedule D1 and D5 use the 5-digit county level FIPS code. And for Schedules D1 and D5, you can also use the de minimis exception, which is explained in more detail in the instructions. I won't get into the details of that here. But essentially, when we look at your Schedules D1 and D5, because of the de minimis exception, it's possible that there could be a few loans which have been included in Schedule B, but don't end up in Schedule D1 or D5. If you're not using the de minimis exception, then the sum of your quarterly data from Schedule B should equal if we summed down the number of originations or dollar value of originations rows in Schedule D1. If you do use the de minimis exception, then when we sum the amount in D1, it can be less than the sum of your quarterly data, but it should certainly not be more. For Schedules D2, D3, D4, D6, and D7, if we sum the number of originations in your Schedule D, that should equal the sum of the quarterly data from Schedule B for that category. So if we're summing your lending to US territories or Puerto Rico in Schedule D, and this shows a total of $1 million in lending, if we then go to each of your Schedule Bs and we sum this category in Schedule B and add up the quarters, that should equal the same number. For Schedule D8, this is kind of 5 Schedule Ds put into one. So as you can see here, you can select between these 5 categories for Schedule D, and those are the 5 categories in the project's category in total. So affordable housing, deeply affordable housing, qualified PWI, deep impact PWI, and community service facility. So if you have a loan which is deeply affordable housing and therefore also affordable housing, you would first include it in a row for affordable housing. You would also include it in a row for deeply affordable housing. If you have a loan that meets this definition for qualified PWI as well as community service facility, you would also include that in 2 rows here, one for each category it meets. So when we end up summing all the data in this schedule for your year, that should equal the sum of all these 5 categories in Schedule B, summing all the quarters. I will also note that I'll be holding QSR office hours on a quarterly basis. So they will always occur about 3 weeks before a QSR report is due. So a QSR report is due at the end of January 2024, and the first office hours will be held Tuesday, January 9th and Thursday, January 11th. You should have received an email with a Zoom link to those office hours. And then the next ones will be held in early April, as there's a QSR deadline at the end of April, and so on. You can also always go to the ECIP webpage, and that will have your link to the impact portal. It'll have the QSR instructions, and we have put these updates and some more clarifications into the instructions, and that's the instructions which will be posted. You'll be able to see the FAQ. The FAQ will include this figure, and you'll be able to download the QSR templates both from the website and from within the impact portal. If you ever have any questions, we encourage you to submit those to ecip@treasury.gov. Thank you so much. We know this reporting isn't easy, and we very much appreciate your effort.